Frustrated, I went to the toilet looking for an outlet, and I got this story, inspired by P and our history. See, I've never understood why our history books never had chapters on our sportsmen's lives. But now I figured that'd be a good way to try and learn about our heroes and how they're supposed to affect our lives. You know, because everybody goes around saying that we are not patriotic enough and that we don't love our country enough. Well, I just think we're a bunch of generally unmotivated people because we're spoon-fed and our living ain't tough. But nothing against the bums and the homeless and the poor and the jobless. With all due respect, sirs, this ain't about you. But if you've got nothing to do, you can join me too. Because there is something that I've been dying to say, and though I'm generalizing, I know I'm sniping today. See, I wonder what would have happened had we swapped fate with our next door neighbor across the Malaccan Straits. I wouldn't be too surprised at all to find out if we can't even put MacD's on our plates and instead found ourselves even worse than their current state. Because it is interesting to note that though free since '49, they are still persistent to fighting for their right to be free and independent, for freedom of artistic expression, liberation from strife, and the right to have a better and racially equal life. Whilst here, we're fighting over the use of a name and defending some people's sovereign right to be dependent on support, dependent on second chances, dependent on quotas, dependent on policies, dependent on politics and slogans, dependent on bribery, dependent on shamans, dependent on word of mouth, dependent on the water purchase from the people down south, dependent on status, dependent on brands, dependent on concerts of foreign artists where you pay just to stand, sit from afar, not even singing along or waving your hands because we're Asians and we're reserved. And we are not loud like the Americans. And we don't like Asians who grew up overseas coming back talking like these. You know, dependent on Hollywood, dependent on piracy, dependent on CSI, American Idol, Heroes, MTV, depending on tuition, depending on straight A's, depending on shopping malls, foreign coaches, Mercedes, depending on what others would think, depending on what others would say, depending on what others would let you do, which depends on what they can't do, so that they won't be too far behind you, and because of that, there isn't so much for you to do, because the options are limited for you, and so after 10 years, you become a them too, believing that you're happy, because you should be happy, because there are worse things that can happen to you when you compare yourself to the citizens of other poorer nations, and so you thank God it didn't happen to you. And now we're making sweeping statements and bold claims that we own the game, indoctrinating others through a not-so-national press, that things are no longer the same. That this country has come so far and we have actually made ourselves a name. A country with great food and culture and world-class buildings and structures. Malaysia, truly Asia. Though they were built by foreign blood and toil, but since it's on our soil, it's all the same in the claim to fame, because everything is on this piece of land where we all stand. Di mana bumi ku pijak, di situ langit ku junjung. A beautiful yet ironic Malay idiom. Because when it comes to the distribution of wealth and the use of a name, they no longer take the piss, and so brandishes the kris, saying that this land is ours and we have the sovereign power because we got here first, so cower to the master and remember from where you came, because we were never the same. You see, I'm not a good teacher of history, but history is a good teacher for me. Because what it taught me is what our ancestors died against so we could be free. They died against status. They died against policies. They died against politics and slogans. They died against colonial trickery. They died against cultural indoctrination. They died against racial segregations. They died against theft of natural resources and the denial of liberty. And all these are our own Malays, Chinese, Indians, even the Mat Saleys, Gurkhas and Punjabis. But strangely, the very things that they died against are apparently the very things that some of us are still desperately dependent on. So if this is Merdeka, then sadly, the Jalur Gemilang will no longer hold sway. Because by this definition, there is no way we can call ourselves independent today. Because all the dictionaries and encyclopedias will say that the definition of independence is the exact opposite of independence. So ladies and gentlemen, well, that's it for me. You've heard my story. Well, I guess now we should all be wondering how it's going to be with his story.